Joining us now, my old colleague from the House. Normally he's on to talk about his intelligence assessment. Today we called on his considerable intellectual power in terms of native intelligence, as well as his familiarity with the ways of Washington. He is former Michigan congressman and the former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Pete Hoekstra. So Pete, it's official now. Eric Shinseki is out. In the final analysis, was it the vulnerable Democrats standing up in the U.S. Senate calling for his resignation that forced Mr. Obama's hand to ask for it today?
Well, I think, J.D. and John, I take a look at this in a slightly larger context. The president had to do something today because he's had a terrible week. Last weekend, he started with the White House, leaking out the information and compromising the station chief, the CIA chief in Afghanistan, a huge blunder by the White House. Wednesday night, you have Edward Snowden doing an hour interview, which reminds the American people not only of the things that were going on at NSA that they didn't like, but that under this president, we had the most massive breach of intelligence information in the history of the world. You then saw this week that the economic numbers were adjusted so that we actually, in the first quarter of this year, had a 1% economic decline, contraction in our economy. And then you put on the continuing saga of the VA. The president had to do something to try to change the narrative. And you're absolutely right. The culmination of a month of bad news for this administration is now leading vulnerable Democrats in the House and the Senate to run from this president in unbelievable numbers.
Well, Pete, it did allow the president, in a way, to get out in front of House Speaker John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi up until last evening. Both of them was saying it's a little too soon to go ahead and call for Shinseki's resignation. Do you think that there was any internal discussion between the president and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in trying to kind of formulate a plan on this?
One of the things that I've noticed with this president is that, and JD and I were there, where Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, they in public, they were very, very hard partisan politicians. But in private, they spent a lot of time negotiating and working together and got some things done. But this president has never been very good at, that negotiation and working with Congress. They may have had a discussion, but, the relationship between this president, congressional leaders on both the Republican and the Democratic side have never been very, very good.
Yeah, Pete, it's almost this situation. How do you spell aloof? Obama. This president very detached from members of his own party. But to be fair about it, and perhaps because I had something personal at stake, you go back to the midterms of 2006, and in those election postmortems where I finished second, along with a number of our other colleagues, to the point where we lost majority status, you mentioned Newt Gingrich. In his election postmortems for 2006, former Speaker Gingrich said, look, we all admire Don Rumsfeld. He had submitted his resignation before to President Bush at that time as Secretary of Defense. And Newt was saying, gee, if Rummy had resigned a week before the midterms, it might have saved maybe 6 to a full dozen Republican seats. You remember back, it was the day after the election when President Bush then accepted Rumsfeld's resignation, and that gave the appearance of kowtowing to the presumptive new Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and Harry Reid. So these things are fraught with, I guess we should say, nonpartisan messiness. But with Mr. Obama, given his aloofness, given his casual approach to this, at least he can say to members of his own party, we've put it to bed. And as you mentioned earlier, it has the benefit of becoming the headline instead of the intelligence, and it's really an injustice to call it a snafu. It was a grievous error in publicizing the name of our top CIA man in Afghanistan. The economy is on life support, and yet Washington can get caught up in this kind of political drama. The sacrifice has been made, if you will, and now the Democrats arguably can turn the page.
They can, but the problem is the issue will be that these problems in the VA, they're not going to change overnight. And I think, as they dig into it, we're going to see that the problems are even much more serious than as bad as it looks right now. This is just, the surface. This is the veneer. When you start digging through it, it's going to get a whole lot worse. And, what we're going to be talking about a little bit later is this now also really undermines the premise of Obamacare, that government-run health care is going to give us good health care.
Well, Pete, we'll talk about that when we come back and have that interview and real quickly. But before we go away, I want to talk about the politics of all this and the importance, at least from Committee Chairman Jeff Miller, the Veteran Affairs Committee, to resist the urge to use this politically, even though Karl Rove's group has already started to do that. And we have an ad that's been produced. And let's play a clip real quick, and I want to get your reaction, Pete.
A national disgrace. Veterans died waiting for care that never came. Senator Mark Begich sits on the Veterans Affairs Committee. His response, if there's a problem, they need to fix it. If there's a problem.
All right, Pete, with about 30 seconds.
Is that appropriate, that kind of using this scandal, these deaths?
All right, with about 30 seconds to go real quick, I just want to get your reaction. Do you think that the Republican Party here, even though Miller is saying so, will be able to resist the urge to be overly political as this moves forward? We heard about Alaska there and those vulnerable states for the Democrats.
Always got to be careful in overplaying your hand. Be cautious. The facts here will speak for themselves. You don't need to overplay it politically.
All right. Thanks a lot, Pete.
Yeah, Pete, we appreciate your perspective, and we look forward to having you back. Coming up, Dr. Ben Carson. He says Americans need to work together to solve problems. His take on this VA healthcare scandal as a practicing physician, indeed as a physician of some renown in pediatric neurology. All that is ahead, plus your comments on America's Forum here on Newsmax TV. Please stay with us.